Hi everyone, and welcome to this video, which is part 2 of a lesson where I'm presenting my guitar arrangement of the song When I'm Gone by Randy Newman. Now, if you've already watched part 1, then welcome back. If you have not watched part 1, then I encourage you to go to part 1 and watch the video by clicking on the link in the description below. Part 1 is useful, if not necessary, because it contains the playthrough, it gets us oriented with some information and resources that I used for the lesson, and in Part 1, you'll learn how to play the intro, and in the process, Part 1 introduces some reusable parts of the arrangement that we'll take advantage of here in Part 2. So, assuming you've watched Part 1, then you have seen the song's intro that was covered at the end of Part 1. Part 2 will continue on from Part 1, starting with measure 10, and it finishes up the song all the way out in measure 42. And my plan is to continue to present small bites, that is, small groups of measures out of the arrangement, and precede those measures with a short clip from the demo to give those measures some context. So let's kick things off with a playthrough of measures 10 and 11. And I'll give you a little bit of advance warning because the playthrough snippets have a tendency to start up and end a little abruptly. The time for us to say goodbye is near. So that was a quick snippet of measures 10 and 11, and hopefully it didn't catch you by surprise, but if it did, just go back and listen to it again. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to show you the tab, and I'm going to play through measures 10 and 11, and for now I'm going to ignore the optional notes and the alternate shapes, and I'll get back to those later. And I've included the lyrics below the tab so you can kind of match up the lyrics to where the chords are played. So here are measures 10 and 11. Starting with the 10th measure, and again, I'm going to ignore for now the alternate shapes and the optional notes. This first chord of the 10th measure is this D chord. And this is just your normal regular D chord played with the open 4th string, and then the regular D shape on the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st strings. The next chord is this G chord. And as I said back in part 1 when I was talking about expectations, some of the chords we're playing are going to be influenced by the fact that we're in drop D tuning. And so this G chord is an example of that. So normally when you play a G in standard tuning, you'd probably be expected to play this 3rd fret of the 6th string to get the G, but the G in drop D tuning is not here, it's down here. So we're not going to play that 6th string, but we're going to play the 2nd fret of the 5th string, the open 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd and 1st string. The last chord of the 10th measure is the G minor, and the shape that you use for the G minor starts with the shape that you just used to play the G chord. And to get the G minor, all you do is you move your index finger from the 2nd fret of the 5th string down to the 1st fret of the 5th string. And then the last note of the 10th measure is the open 5th string. So after you play the G minor, just remove your index finger from the 1st fret of the 5th string and play the open 5th string. So if I play the 10th measure slowly now, this is what it sounds like. Measure 11 should be pretty easy for everyone, and I say that because measure 11 only has 3 simple chords in it, and 2 of those chords are almost identical. And another reason I say that is because I played measure 11 in part 1 of this lesson, and I used it as an example when I was explaining alternate shapes and optional notes. So I must have played measure 11 around 6 times. So if you watched the part 1 lesson, then you've already seen measure 11, and we'll look at it again here. Now I'm going to cover measure 11 just a little bit out of order. The first chord of the measure is this simple D chord played with the open 4th string. The last chord of the measure is the same simple D chord, but this time played with the open fifth string. And the chord in the middle, the second chord of the measure, is this G chord. Now the G is played with different variations in different parts of the song, but this G shape is something that we've seen before. This is the same G shape that we used in measure 7 when we learned the intro measures 6, 7, and 8. And this G shape is played with the 5th fret of the 6th string and the open 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. So the three chords of measure 11 are the D played with the open 4th string, the G, and the D with the open 5th string. Now there are a couple of extra notes. Actually, they're not extra notes, they're necessary notes that I need to add to measure 11 in order to round out and finish out the measure. So when you play this first D chord, you let that D chord ring and then you play the 5th fret of the 1st string. So it sounds like this. And then you play the G chord, and then you play the last D chord with the open 5th string, and the last note that you add to measure 11 is this open 6th string, which is the low D. And that's the last note of measure 11. So to play measure 11 all the way through with all the chords and all the notes, it sounds like this. Now the material we just covered is basically the block chords that pretty much line up with the piano accompaniment in the Randy Newman video. But if you look at the tab, you'll see some number of optional notes along with a couple of alternate shapes, and that's what we're going to look at next. Let's start out by looking at this first chord of the 10th measure. And this is going to take a little bit of explaining because I had trouble deciding how I was going to show this in the tab. I couldn't decide if I was going to show this as an alternate shape or optional notes, but I decided to go with the alternate shape approach because you could choose to do it one of two ways, and either choice you make is mutually exclusive. So one way you can play it is to play this D shape, this block chord, with the open 4th string. And if you play it this way, then that's the way it's played on the piano in the Randy Newman video. The other way you can play it is to play it with these opening two notes, the open 4th string and the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, followed by the 2nd and 1st strings of the D shape. So again, you can either play the D chord with the open 4th string or these opening two notes. But what makes this a little different than other parts of the song is that I think this is the only place in the song where the way you choose to play it has an effect on the way the lyrics are sung. It changes the timing of the lyrics. So again, if you play it with the block chord, it'll sound like the Randy Newman video, and it'll sound like this. The time for us to say goodbye is near. But if you choose to play those opening two notes, the timing of the lyrics shift a little bit, and you have to sing the lyrics with that opening first note of the measure, and it sounds like this. The time for us to say goodbye is near. So you can choose to sing it one way or the other, but that's what the tab is trying to describe. I almost forgot to talk about the alternate shape in the 11th measure, and it's a pretty easy shape, so I think I can explain it in about a minute. So if I play the 11th measure without the alternate shape, it sounds like this. Now this alternate shape is meant to replace this G in the middle of the measure with this G. And this G is played with the 2nd fret of the 5th string, the open 4th and 3rd strings, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. So instead of playing this, you play this. So if I play the 11th measure with the alternate shape, it sounds like this. So either way it sounds good, and whatever you choose to play will depend on personal preference. Now some people might think that the alternate shape sounds more like the way it's played on the piano in the Randy Newman video, but it's your choice. Either way sounds good. So let's go ahead and finish up our discussion of measures 10 and 11 by talking about these optional notes. There are only 4 of them, and they're all played on the 3rd string. And 2 of them are played on the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and the other 2 are played on the open 3rd string. And so what I'd like to do is, I'd like to play through the measures and talk through how the optional notes are played so you can hear what they sound like and also see where they fall. And I'll try to emphasize those optional notes as I play them. And I will say that whenever I play these optional notes, I almost always play those alternate shapes and notes at the beginning of measure 10. So here's what they sound like. There's the first optional note, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. There's the second one, the open 3rd string. There's the 3rd optional note, the open 3rd string. There's the last one, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. And there's the last note of the 11th measure. So I'll play it through one more time so you can hear what it sounds like. All right, and that wraps up the discussion of measures 10 and 11, and now we can move on to measures 12 and 13. The day I hoped would never come is here. So that was the playthrough, or the demo, of measures 12 and 13, and as usual, here's the tab for those measures. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to play through those 2 measures, but I'm going to play it specifically the way it was played in the demo that you just heard. And you might ask, well, why wouldn't you do that? Well, there's a reason for it, and I'll get to that in just a little bit. So here's what measures 12 and 13 sound like. To begin with, this 12th measure is relatively easy to play. It only has 2 chords in it, and one of the chords is something we've seen plenty of times, and the other chord is something that we've seen variations of. So this first chord is just a regular D played with the open 4th string. The next chord is a D7th. Now we normally play the D7th. Sounds like that, but what we're going to do is we're going to move this F sharp from here down to here. And we'll play this D7th with the open 5th string, the 4th fret of the 4th string, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and the 1st fret of the 2nd string. So that's all there is to measure 12. Now I'm going to cover measure 13 a little differently. When I played through measures 12 and 13 a little bit ago, I said I was going to play it specifically the way it was played in the demo. And the reason I did that is because after listening more closely to the Randy Newman video, and after looking more closely at the piano score, I found out that I was playing measure 13 wrong. So rather than re-record the entire playthrough of the song, I thought I would just point out how I played it in the demo and then correct it here. The first correction is to this G chord at the beginning of measure 13. And I'm going to call this the G1 chord, and we've seen this G1 chord a couple of times already. And it's played simply with the 5th fret of the 6th string and the open 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. Now you can play this G1 chord if you want to, but I think that this alternate G chord, and I'll call this the G2, sounds more like what's played in the Randy Newman video. So instead of playing G1, I think it's better to play G2. And the G2 chord is played with the 2nd fret of the 5th string, the open 4th and 3rd strings, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. The next correction I made was to add in this extra note that's played on the open 4th string after playing the G2 chord. And And again, the reason I added this note is because I heard it in the video and I saw it in the piano score. The last correction is a change to the way the E7th chord is played. In the demo, it's played like this. But after listening to the Randy Newman video again more closely, I realized I was not playing this E note that I clearly heard in the video. So now I'm playing the E7th chord with that E note. And I have not spent a lot of time on specific fretboard or left hand positions, but I think I'll make a suggestion here. And that is when you play this G2 chord, you play it using your pinky to play the 3rd fret of the 2nd string, and you use your middle finger to play the 2nd fret of the 5th string. And the benefit to that is that when you play the next chord, the E7th, the pinky and the middle fingers stay where they are, and all you have to do is plant your index and ring fingers on the fretboard to play that E7th chord. And the last note you play is this E note on the open 1st string, following that E7th chord. So now if I play the 12th and the 13th measures with all the corrections, they sound like this. And I managed to sneak in a little arpeggio on that E7th chord. Let's talk real quickly about this other alternate shape in measure 13, the G sharp diminished. This is basically the same G sharp diminished that's played in measure 8 of the intro. And I'm not a real big fan of the G sharp diminished played in this spot, but it serves a purpose that I'll talk about in just a minute. And in this case, it can be played instead of the E7th. And it sounds a lot like that E7th. And this alternate shape, the G sharp diminished, is sort of related to the alternate shapes in measure 12. The first alternate shape in measure 12 is this D chord, and it's simply played with the open 5th string instead of the open 4th string. The next alternate shape in measure 12 is the D7th chord, and here we move the F sharp note from the 4th string to the 6th string. And it sounds like this. And we've seen this D7th chord before. This is the same D7th that we played in the 6th measure of the intro. So now if you play these two alternate shapes and you then play the G1 chord that I spoke about earlier and follow that with the G sharp diminished, together they sound like this. And what you end up with is a chord progression that supports this sequence of bass notes. And although it doesn't match the original song, you still might like the way it sounds. So let's quickly finish up measures 12 and 13 by looking at these few optional notes. The first of these optional notes are simply a replaying of the 2nd and 3rd strings of that first D chord. The other optional notes are played after the D7th chord and are played on the open 1st string and the 2nd and 3rd strings of that D7th. So if I play measure 12 with these optional notes and play the corrected measure 13, it sounds like this. So that finishes up measures 12 and 13, and now we can move on to measures 14 and 15. Though many hearts are broken, we must somehow carry on. So here's the tab for measures 14 and 15, and this is what those measures sound like. And what I think I'll do here is I'll just play the simple block chords instead of playing the arpeggios and optional notes that were played in the demo. Measures 14 and 15 are pretty straightforward, especially compared to measures 12 and 13. So measure 14 starts out with a D chord that's played with the open 5th string, and that's followed by this A sharp diminished 7th. And this is the same A sharp diminished 7th that's played in measure 7 of the intro, and it's played with the 1st fret of the 5th string, the 2nd fret of the 4th string, the open 3rd string, and the 2nd fret of the 2nd string. Measure 15 starts with a B minor chord, and it's played on the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th strings. And the next chord is a D7 that's also played on only the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th strings. And the last chord, the 15th measure, is this G chord. And we've seen this G chord plenty of times already, and I called this the G1 chord in measure 13. So if I play measures 14 and 15, they sound like this. Measure 14 has some optional notes, and the first of these optional notes are just a simple replaying of the 2nd and 3rd strings of that D chord. The other optional notes are played after the A sharp diminished 7th chord and are played on the open 1st string and the 2nd and 3rd strings of that A sharp diminished 7th. So if I play measures 14 and 15 with the optional notes, they sound like this. And that's all there is to measures 14 and 15. So let's move on to measures 16 and 17. "'Cause I think you're gonna miss me when I'm gone." Okay, so let's talk about measures 16 and 17. Measure 16 is pretty simple, and measure 17 is not too complex either, but it has an entire alternate measure that I'll talk about in just a little bit. But before I get into the details, here's how measures 16 and 17 are played. And in the demo you just heard, I played arpeggios in measure 16, but I think I'll just play the block chords here, but it can be played either way. Let's start by looking into the details of measure 16, which has just 2 chords in it. And I think what I'll do is I'll cover the chords, the alternate shapes, and the optional notes for measure 16 all at once here. So the first chord in measure 16 is this D chord played with the open 4th string. Or if you want to, you can play it with the open 5th string instead. The optional notes following the D chord are the same as the optional notes that we saw in measures 12 and 14. And for these optional notes, you just replay the 2nd and 3rd strings of that D chord. The next chord in measure 16 is this A7th, and you can play the A7th in one of 2 ways. You can play it with either the open 5th string and the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd strings, or you can play it with the open 5th string and the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th strings. And I think I prefer to play it on the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd strings. The optional notes here are just a replaying of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd strings for that A7th chord. Measure 17 is a little more interesting. The tab below looks like there are 3 measures, but that third measure is just an alternate measure 17. I did that because the alternate measure is different enough that I wanted to kind of separate it from what I'll call the default measure 17. So the default measure is basically how it's played on the piano in the Randy Newman video, and the alternate measure is from the David Whitehead video. And I didn't have access to a piano score for the David Whitehead video, so I had to just figure out the alternate 17th measure by just listening to it. And I did something a little different here. I re-recorded 2 short vocal and guitar videos so you can hear the differences between the Randy Newman version and the David Whitehead version. So what I'll do here is I'll play those 2 videos so you can hear those differences, and then I'll dive into the details of each version. So this first video is my short demo of the Randy Newman version, what I'm calling the default version. 'Cause I think you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. So that was the Randy Newman version of measure 17, and this next short video is my demo of the alternate David Whitehead version. 'Cause I think you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. Now, in case you could not or did not hear the differences between those 2 versions, I'll point out the differences here, and then I'll talk about how to play each version. So the default Randy Newman version sounds like this. And it has an underlying melody, if you can call it that sounds like this. So if I play it one more time, it sounds like that. And this is how the alternate David Whitehead version sounds. And it has an underlying melody that sounds like this. So if I play it one more time, this is how it sounds. So let's look at how each of those 2 versions are played, starting with the Randy Newman version. It starts out with a D chord played with the open 4th string, followed by a single A note played on the open 5th string. And it sounds like this. The next chord is a G chord with some choices. The first choice is that G2 chord that we saw back in measure 13, played on the 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. The second choice is another version of the G chord that's similar to the G2 chord we just played. You still play the 2nd fret of the 5th string, but you shift the other strings you're playing down 1 string and add the 3rd fret of the 1st string. So instead of playing this, you play this. And I have trouble deciding which of these G chords to play, so I play either one. It just depends on which one I hit while I'm playing it. The last chord of this measure is the C-shaped D that I introduced and emphasized way back in part 1 of the lesson. And this version of the C-shaped D is played with the open 5th string. So once more, here's how the default measure 17 sounds. Now let's take a look at the alternate measure 17, the David Whitehead version. This version starts out with 2 notes played on the open 4th string and the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. And that's followed by playing the single D note on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. Next, you play the 2nd fret of the 5th string and the open 3rd string. But what you should get at the same time is the sustained note of the open 4th string that you just played and is still ringing when you play these 2 notes. So you should still hear this open fourth string. The last chord of this measure is the same as what we played in the Randy Newman version, the C-shaped D played with the open fifth string. So here's how this alternate measure 17 sounds. So once more, just to wrap things up, here are measures 16 and 17 played with the default and alternate measure 17. And that does it for measures 16 and 17, and now we can continue on to measures 18 and 19. Hang on just a minute. Before we get to measures 18 and 19, I want to take a minute to explain something. For the last 8 measures, I spent some amount of time showing you a bunch of optional notes. And some of you might justifiably ask, why do we have all these optional notes? The short answer is that they fill in some blank space. The main reason I added these optional notes is to have something to play instead of just the block chords, especially when I'm playing the song without singing the lyrics. In fact, here's a short video of me doing just that, playing measures 10 through 17 with all the optional notes. So that's an example of the music without the lyrics. But as you heard in the playthrough, there are times when I throw in some of the optional notes when the lyrics are sung to again fill in some of the blank space. And I'm not alone in this approach. In fact, if you listen to the Mark Starr video, you'll hear some extra notes thrown in, and he routinely plays each of the block chords twice as he sings the song to fill in some blank space. So he might play it something like this. So I think it might be a natural tendency on the guitar to add a little more to the song than you might otherwise get away with on the piano. Okay, enough of that. Let's get to measures 18 and 19. I thought my life was over when we met. So here's the tab for measures 18 and 19, and before we get into the details, here's what measures 18 and 19 sound like. The 18th measure opens up with this low D note played on the open 6th string. And this opening D note is in the piano score, and I think I can barely hear it in the Randy Newman video, and I'm pretty sure there's something there because of the timing of how the lyric is sung in that video. So following that opening D note, the first chord is a D chord played with the open 4th string. Simple enough. The next chord is this G chord that we've seen many times before, followed by the G minor that we've also seen already. So measure 18 sounds like this. Measure 19 is simple. It starts with the same D chord played with the open 4th string, followed by the G chord that we just played, and that's followed by a D chord with the open 5th string. And measure 19 finishes up the same way measure 18 started, with the low D note played on the open 6th string. So once more, here are measures 18 and 19. The last thing to look at here for these measures are the optional notes and the one alternate shape. And this stuff should sound a little familiar because it's very similar to what we saw in measures 10 and 11. So I'll quickly cover it and just talk through and play through the measures so you can see and hear how it's played. To start with, there's an alternate shape around this first D chord. If I play the opening low D note with this D chord played as a block chord, it sounds like this. Or for this D chord, you can play the 2nd fret of the 3rd string and then the 1st and 2nd strings of that D chord. So you can either play this or this. And that's all there is to this alternate shape. These optional notes are very much like the ones we saw in measures 10 and 11. And like those measures, there are 4 optional notes that are all played on the 3rd string. And all are played on either the open 3rd string or the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. But measures 18 and 19 add 2 more optional notes that measures 10 and 11 don't have. And we'll see and hear those as I run through it. So here are all the optional notes for measures 18 and 19. And I'll start off by playing the alternate shape in measure 18 and then point out the optional notes as I play them. There's the first optional note, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, open 3rd string, open 5th string, open 5th string again, open 3rd string, 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and then the closing D note of measure 19. And this is what measures 18 and 19 sound like with the alternate shape and all the optional notes. And that's it for measures 18 and 19. So now on to measures 20 and 21. So little to remember, so much to forget. As usual, here's the tab for measures 20 and 21, and here's a quick playthrough before we look at what's inside. Measure 20 starts out with these 2 D chords that are unique to the arrangement. They're only played like this in measure 20. The first D chord is played with the open 4th string and the 2nd fret of the 3rd and 1st strings. The second of these D chords is played with the 4th fret of the 4th string, the 3rd fret of the 2nd string, and the 5th fret of the 1st string. Now when you play these 2 chords, you have to pay attention to, and you have to be deliberate with the right hand, because the first chord is played on the 4th, 3rd, and 1st strings, and the second chord is played on the 4th, 2nd, and 1st strings. So your right hand is switching around a little bit. The last chord of measure 20 is easy. It's just a B minor, followed by playing the 4th fret of the 4th string. So measure 20 sounds like this. Measure 21 has just 2 relatively simple shapes in it, basically an E7th and an A7th. The E7th is played with the open 4th string, the 1st fret of the 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. Then this E7th is followed by playing the 2nd fret of the 6th string. The last chord is this A7th played on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings, followed by the open 5th string. So measure 21 sounds like this. And once more, measures 20 and 21 sound like this. And next come measures 22 and 23. Though it was you who saw me through the darkness to the dawn. So that was a quick demo of measures 22 and 23, and here is the tab. Now, measures 22 and 23 should sound a little familiar. These measures are played pretty much identically to measures 6, 7, and 8. And since I covered measures 6, 7, and 8 in quite a lot of detail, by the way, back in part 1 of this lesson, I will not go over it again here. So, after you've learned to measure 6, 7, and 8, then just play it here for measures 22 and 23. And now we can just jump ahead to measures 24 and 25. Still I think you're gonna miss me when I'm gone. Okay, so here's the tab for measures 24 and 25, and this is what those measures sound like. Measure 24 starts with this D chord played with an open 4th string. Next you play another sort of D chord on the open 5th string and the 2nd fret of the 3rd and 1st strings. And that's followed by a sort of A chord played on the open 3rd and 1st strings. Now when you play this D chord, the A note on the open 5th string sustains into the A chord that you play next, which means you do not replay that open 5th string for this A chord. Measure 25 is just a little more challenging than most of what we've seen so far. There are a few more moving parts with both the right and the left hand, and you'll see what I mean as we go through it. The first chord of measure 25, which I have not figured out what the name of this chord is yet, is played with the 5th fret of the 6th string, the 2nd fret of the 4th string, and the open 3rd and 2nd strings. Next, you play the open 5th string and the 4th fret of the 4th string. And some parts of that first chord sustain into this second chord, and together they sound like this. And that's followed by a G chord that we've seen plenty of times already, played with the 2nd fret of the 5th string, the open 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. Now you'll notice that there's an optional note for this G chord that's played with the open 4th string. And I actually prefer to play it that way. I think it sounds just a little better. The last chord of measure 25 is that C-shaped D that keeps showing up. And this C-shaped D is played with the open 5th string. Now Now, at the risk of extending the length of this video lesson beyond reasonable limits, I'd like to stop here for a minute to talk about the left-hand positions that I use for measure 25. The positions for the first two chords are pretty straightforward. For the first chord, which I think I discovered is an E minor, I play that with my index finger on the 2nd fret of the 4th string and my pinky on the 5th fret of the 6th string. And the 2nd and 3rd strings are played open. For the next chord, I play the 4th fret of the 4th string with my ring finger and play the open 5th string. Now for the next chord, the G chord, I make a slight change in the way I normally play it. In most other parts of the arrangement, I play this G chord using my index finger on the 2nd fret of the 5th string, and my ring finger plays the D note on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. But using my ring finger for this D note is awkward because I'm using my ring finger to play the 2nd chord, and it's a pain to have to pick up my ring finger to play that D note for the G chord. So here's what I do. Instead of playing the D note with my ring finger, I play it with my middle finger instead, and that has two benefits. It makes the transition from that 2nd chord to the 3rd chord, the G chord, much easier. And not only that, it means that I don't have to move my middle finger to play the last chord of the measure, which is the C-shaped D. Now the Randy Newman video and the piano score end measure 25 right there. But I feel like the last chord of this measure is just kind of hanging out there unresolved and just asking for something to finish it off. So I close out the measure by playing this optional low D note on the open 6th string, and it sounds like this. One last thing I'll mention about measure 25 is this one alternate shape. And I put a black diamond over this alternate shape because those of you who are familiar with downhill skiing will recognize this symbol as meaning most difficult. And the only reason I included this alternate shape is because the piano score has a D note in it for this chord, and the only way I can figure out how to play this D note is with the 3rd fret of the 2nd string that I'm showing there in the tab. But that shape is most difficult to play, and I don't think it sounds very good. It's in the piano score, but I don't think I'll ever play it. So one last time, this is what measures 24 and 25 sound like. And now we can move on to measures 26 and 27. I'm a modest man and it hurts me to say these things to you. Okay, keeping with the program, here is the tab for measures 26 and 27, and here's a short preview of those measures. Measure 26 starts with a simple B minor chord played on the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th strings, followed by a single B note played with the 2nd fret of the 5th string. The next chord and notes have elements of a G chord in them, and it's yet one more variation of the G chord. Some time ago, I said that when we played a G chord like this, that we were typically expected to play the 3rd fret of the 6th string to get the G note. But because we're in drop D tuning, this G note is on the 5th fret of the 6th string. And what I said back then was we don't play that note. Well, in this case, we do play that G note on the 5th fret of the 6th string. So instead of playing a G chord like this, in measure 26, we're playing it like this. So this G chord is played with the 5th fret of the 6th string, the open 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd and 1st strings. And you don't need to be too precise with your ring finger on the 6th string. It's okay if you mute that 5th string in the process, because you're not playing that 5th string anyway. But we're not done yet. The last thing we add is this 5th fret of the 1st string. Because what we're aiming for is this sequence of notes. The 5th fret of the 1st string, followed by the 3rd fret of the 1st string, and then the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. And what you get is this. So if you combine all that with this G chord, the complete chord and notes sound like this. Or you can play it with an arpeggio, which is what I usually do. So measure 26 sounds like this. Measure 27 starts out with something that should be very familiar by now, the C-shaped D chord, although this C-shaped D comes with just a little bit of a twist. Normally, we would play the C-shaped D on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings, and either the open 5th string or the open 6th string. But in this measure, we play the C-shaped D chord with the open 1st string instead. And this chord is immediately followed by replaying the D note on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. And I think in this measure I always play it as an arpeggio like this. And you see what we're doing here is we're working our way into playing this simple underlying melody of this chord progression. And this C-shaped D and the D note that follows it are the beginning of that melody that's played through the rest of the measure like this. The next chord in the measure is an A sharp diminished 7th, which we've also seen a few times already. But as a reminder, it's played on the 1st fret of the 5th string, the 2nd fret of the 4th string, the open 3rd string, and the 2nd fret of the 2nd string. And this A sharp diminished 7th is followed by playing the open 1st string. The last chord of measure 27 is a B minor played on the 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. And that's followed by replaying the 4th fret of the 3rd string. And I think I also play this as an arpeggio as well. So this is how measure 27 sounds, and listen for that underlying melody. And finally, here's a replay of measures 26 and 27. Next up is measures 28 and 29. But after all we've been through, it's the least that I can do. Measures 28 and 29 are probably the easiest measures in the whole arrangement. And as you can see in the tab below, there are only 4 relatively simple chords, and this is what they sound like. Measure 28 has 2 chords that are both played with the open 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. The only difference between these two chords is that the first chord, the E minor 7th, is played with the 2nd fret of the 6th string, and the next chord, the G chord, is played with the 5th fret of the 6th string. So measure 28 simply sounds like this. Measure 29 has only two chords in it as well, the E7th and the A7th. This E7th is played on the 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. And the A7th is also played on the 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. So measure 29 sounds like this. Now there are a few optional notes that I sometimes throw in there to fill in the blank space with these two block chords in measure 29. The three optional notes following the E7th are all played on the 2nd string and are played with the open 2nd string and the 2nd and 3rd frets of the 2nd string like this. So with that E7th chord, they sound like this. The optional notes following the A7th chord are played with the open 1st string and the 2nd and 3rd strings of the A7th chord. And sometimes, although the tab doesn't show it, I'll play the single open 1st string at the end of that A7th chord like this. So once more, measures 28 and 29 sound like this, and I think what I'll do is I'll play that one optional note at the end of the A7th chord. And that's what measures 28 and 29 sound like, and now we can jump into measures 30 and 31. So instead of just goodbye, I'll say so long. Measures 28 and 29 were probably the easiest measures in the arrangement. Measures 30 and 31 are, I think, a little more challenging, especially measure 31. But we'll get into the details one step at a time as we work our way through the tab. And here's a preview of what we're about to get into. As far as I can tell, there are 3 verses in this song. One verse starts in measure 10, the next verse starts in measure 18, and measure 30 is the third of the 3 verses. And if you think back or look back at those other measures, you'll see that they each contain the same 3 chords, a D major, a G major, and a G minor that sounded something like this. Now those 3 chords are also here in measure 30. And again, if you can remember way back when we learned measures 10 and 18, you may recall that those measures had a bunch of optional notes. Well, in the Randy Newman video, the piano accompaniment for measure 30 is only slightly what I'd call busier than the usual block chords that are played in much of the song. So in my arrangement, I made measure 30 a little busier by adding those optional notes as, I don't know what I'd call them, maybe regular, standard, or mandatory notes. And you'll see what I mean as we go through it. The first chord of measure 30 is a standard D chord, but the measure starts with the open 4th string, then the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, followed by the 2nd and 1st strings of that D chord. And you follow that by replaying the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. And it sounds like this. And that should sound at least a little familiar. The next chord is this G chord that's played on the 2nd fret of the 5th string, the open 3rd string, and the 3rd fret of the 2nd and 1st strings. And you follow that by replaying the open third string. And it sounds like this. Now there's an alternate shape between the D chord and this G chord that's really only one note, the low D note on the open sixth string. And I put this in here because I think I can hear it in the Randy Newman video, and the piano score has this low D note in the measure. So you can play this low D instead of the A note prior to the G chord. And I'll play it both ways here and try to emphasize the difference. So instead of this, you can play it like this. The last chord of measure 30 is this G minor chord that's played by simply taking the G chord shape that we just played and moving from the second fret of the fifth string to the first fret of the fifth string. And finally, measure 30 wraps up with the open fifth string. So all of measure 30 sounds like this. Measure 31 gets more interesting. To begin with, that A note that you just played on the open fifth string at the end of measure 30 sustains into measure 31. So do not replay that A note at the beginning of measure 31. But that sustained A note is not in the piano score for measure 30. I added it here for two reasons. One was to give me a passing note that would smooth the transition from the G minor in measure 30 to the upcoming D chord in measure 31. The other reason was because I needed that low A note, which is in the measure 31 piano score, for that D chord we're about to play. And since all four fingers of my right hand are busy playing the block chord for that D chord, I had to sort of borrow that A note from the previous measure. So let's break down measure 31. And first we'll look at doing it the hard way, and then we'll look at the slightly less hard way. The first chord of measure 31 is a variation of the C-shaped D. In fact, this particular C-shaped D is close to an actual C shape. And what we do here is we place a half bar on the second fret, we play the third fret of the second string, and the fourth fret of the fourth string. And that's followed by playing the fifth fret of the first string. So here's what this very short sequence sounds like, starting with that A note that we get from measure 30. And one of the things that can be difficult is transitioning from that G minor in measure 30 to this C-shaped D, and then playing that high A note on the fifth fret of the first string. And I'll try to play it slowly so you can get an idea of what it sounds like. And that is kind of difficult, but the alternate shape in measure 31 helps with that, and I'll get to that in just a minute. The next chord in measure 31 is sort of an A minor seventh. And I say sort of because if you play it the way it's written in the piano score, with just the open fifth string and the first fret of the second string, it sounds less like an A minor seventh. But if you play the optional notes, the open first and third strings, it sounds more like an A minor seventh, and I usually play those optional notes anyway. Next is this G chord, and it's a little like what I called the G1 chord way back in measure 13. It's played with the fifth fret of the sixth string, the open third and second strings, and the third fret of the first string. And the last chord of measure 31 is just a regular D chord played with the open fourth string. And in the Randy Newman video, that's where measure 31 ends. but I include two optional notes that I usually play, the second fret of the third string and the open sixth string. And it sounds like this. So this is what we have so far for measure 31. Now what I've just shown you is the sort of hard way to play measure 31. Now let's look at the somewhat less hard way, which involves the alternate shape at the beginning of measure 31. This alternate shape is a regular D chord with an open fourth string. And that's a substitute for this C-shaped D. And with this alternate shape, you lose one thing and you gain about three things. And your decision to play the alternate shape comes down to whether or not you're okay with giving up that one thing that you lose. And the thing that you lose when you play this alternate shape is this F sharp that's part of the C-shaped D. And this F sharp is in the piano score, so if you're a purist or particular about staying as close to the piano score as possible, then you might decide to stick with the C-shaped D, the more difficult way to play this measure. But these are the three things you gain, in my opinion, if you play the regular D chord. First, the transition from the G minor in measure 30 to this D chord in measure 31 is a little easier because you don't have to move the ring finger of your left hand, and it's just an easier motion from the G minor to the D chord, and it looks and sounds like this. And you can see how smooth and easy that transition is. The second thing you gain is that it's a little easier to play the fifth fret of the first string following this D chord. And third, I think it's easier to transition from this D chord to the A minor seventh. In fact, you can start to pre-position your left hand or move in the direction of that A minor seventh as you play the fifth fret of the first string like this. And I'll do that one more time. And as a side note, I think if you didn't tell anyone what you were doing, no one would notice the difference between the hard way and the easier way. And lately, I've begun to think that I might prefer to play it the easier way because it sounds almost the same as the hard way, and it gives me a better chance of hitting all the notes and chords. So here's what measure 31 sounds like played the easier way. And finally, to wrap up, here's what measures 30 and 31 sound like, played the hard way, and then we'll move on to measures 32 and 33. And as for the light by which you see me, leave it on. Here's the tab for measures 32 and 33, and here's a preview of how those measures are played. Now what I just played included the optional notes in measure 32 because that's how I usually play it. But I'll cover measure 32 with and without those two simple optional notes. The first chord in measure 32 is a C-shaped D that's the same as the C-shaped D that we played the hard way in measure 31. But this one's a little easier to play because the transition from the D chord at the end of measure 31 is pretty easy. So as a reminder, this C-shaped D is formed by placing a half bar on the second fret, playing the third fret of the second string, and then the fourth fret of the fourth string. Then, if you don't play the optional note, this D chord is followed by playing the open fourth string. If you do play the optional note, then this D chord is followed by replaying the third string of the chord and then the open fourth string. And I usually play this as an arpeggio. The next chord is a B minor played on the fourth, third, second, and first strings, followed by playing the second fret of the fifth string. And the optional note here is the third string of that B minor chord. And I usually play this as an arpeggio as well. Measure 33 is similar to something that we've already seen, but I'll explain that in a minute. This measure starts out with an E7th chord that's influenced by the drop D tuning that we're in. And what I mean by that is we play a somewhat normal E7th chord, but we add the second fret of the sixth string to get that low E note that we need. And what we do here is we play the fifth, fourth, third, and second strings of this E7th chord, followed by the low E note on the second fret of the sixth string. And then we play the open second string, and it sounds like this. The rest of measure 33 has just one simple shape and a couple of notes. This first shape is played with just the fourth fret of the fifth string and the second fret of the third string. Then you finish off the measure by playing the open first string followed by the open fifth string. And together it sounds like this. So all of measure 33 sounds like this. Now let's take a minute to talk about the two alternate shapes in measure 33. A little bit ago I said that measure 33 was similar to something that we've already seen, and what I was talking about was measure 21. Here's a replay of measures 20 and 21, and listen to what's played at the end of this phrase. So measure 21 sounds like this. And measure 33 sounds like this. And I think it's pretty easy to tell that these two measures sound very similar. And what I've done here is I've inserted measure 21 into measure 33 as alternate shapes. The chords of measure 21 are similar enough that you can play them instead of the so-called primary shapes of measure 33. The first alternate shape is played on the open fourth string, the first fret of the third string, and the third fret of the second string. And that's followed by the second fret of the sixth string and the open second string. And it sounds like this. The next alternate shape is just a simple A7th played on the fourth, third, and second strings. And that's followed by the open first string and the open fifth string. And together they sound like this. So measure 33 played with the alternate shapes sounds like this. And you can choose to play measure 33 either way. It's a matter of personal preference, or you might think that one way is easier to play than the other. I prefer to play the primary shapes for the measure because I like the sound of that B note in the first chord. That B note right there. And I also like the sound of the C sharp in that second chord. This C sharp right here. So measures 32 and 33 played all together sound like this. now we can talk about measures 34 and 35. I'm a better man than I was before, knowing you has made me strong. Here's the tab for measures 34 and 35. And the only things I have to say about these two measures is that they are the same as measures 6, 7, and 8 that we covered way back in part 1 of this lesson. And they're the same as measures 22 and 23 that we zoomed past a little while ago. So if you learn those measures there, then play them here. Now we can go ahead and look at something more interesting like measures 36 and 37. And I sure am gonna miss you when I'm gone. Here, of course, is the tab for measures 36 and 37, and here's what those measures sound like. Measure 36 might sound familiar because we saw the exact same thing in measure 24. It starts with a simple D chord played with the open 4th string, or alternately the open 5th string. And that's followed by what really is just another form of a D chord played on the open 5th string, the 2nd fret of the 3rd string, and the 2nd fret of the 1st string. Next we play a form of an A7th chord, and when we were learning measure 24, I think I mistakenly called this a form of an A major chord, but this time I think I got it right. Anyway, this A7th chord is played with only the open 3rd string and the open 1st string. And you'll notice that in the tab there's a tie between the A note played on the open 5th string for the D chord and this A7th chord. And as a reminder, this means that this A note sustains into that A7th chord, so you do not replay the A note on the 5th string for the A7th chord. So measure 36 sounds like this. The first 3 chords of measure 37 are easy to play with the right hand because all 3 of these chords are played on the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings, which I'm going to refer to as those strings. The first chord of measure 37 is a B minor played on the 2nd fret of the 5th string and those strings. The next chord is a D7th played with the open 5th string and those strings. And the third chord of the measure is a G chord played with the 5th fret of the 6th string and the open those strings. Which is kind of a weird way to say it, but I think you get what I mean. And you may have noticed that I sort of slide into the D7th chord from the B minor like this. And I'll overemphasize it here so you can hear what I'm talking about. And I do it kind of subconsciously, but I think it's a smoother transition between the B minor and the D7th instead of just picking up and moving between the chords like this. The last chord of measure 37 is this G sharp diminished 7th. That sounds a lot like something we've already heard more than once. In part 1 of this lesson, we learned how to play measures 6, 7, and 8, and here in part 2, we saw the other identical measures, chords, and shapes that went like this. Now measures 6, 7, and 8 and the similar measures ended with this G sharp diminished chord, Or actually, this is very close to an E7, so it might actually be an E7. But measure 37 ends with this G sharp diminished 7th. And they almost sound identical, but of course they're not. And the difference is right here. The G sharp diminished, or the E7th, depending on what you want to call it, sounds like this. And that note makes the difference. And the G sharp diminished 7th sounds like this. And that's the different note right there. So measure 37 ends with this G sharp diminished 7th that's played on the 6th fret of the 6th string, which is pretty hard to say, by the way, the 8th fret of the 5th string, the open 4th string, the 7th fret of the 3rd string, and the open 2nd string. And the last note of the measure is this open 1st string. And I always play this as an arpeggio. And once more, here's how measures 36 and 37 sound. And now we can move on to the final part of the lesson, which is measures 38 through 42. Yes, I sure am gonna miss you when I'm gone. Here's the tab for the last 5 measures of the song, and here's what those measures sound like. Measure 38 has 2 simple chords. The first is a regular D chord played with the open 4th string. And the second chord is an A7th played on the 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, and 1st strings. And I usually play both of these chords as an arpeggio. Measure 39 is without a doubt the easiest measure in the arrangement. It has nothing in it but a rest, so don't play anything, just rest. Measure 40 is the start of the song's outro, and in my opinion, measures 40 through 42 are the most melodic and the most beautiful parts of the song. But these last few measures are one last example of some compromises that I had to make when I put together the guitar arrangement, and here's why. If you listen to the Randy Newman video, this outro is played with an underlying melody that sounds like this. Now, in order to match the notes in the octave of the piano arrangement, I would have to play something like this combination of chords and notes. But I didn't like the way that sounded, and I don't think it was close enough to the piano arrangement. So I did something here that's similar to what I did in the intro. I moved part of that melody down an octave, and I kept the last few notes in the original octave. So in my arrangement, that underlying melody sounds like this. And here's how the chords and shapes are put together to accommodate those changes. The first chord in measure 40 is a C-shaped D played with the open 6th string and just the 4th and 3rd strings of that C-shaped D chord. Now you can optionally play it with the second string of that chord, but you run a slight risk of masking or burying the underlying melody of the outro if you throw in too many other notes. But having said that, I usually play it with the optional note. The next chord is an E minor 7th played with the second fret of the 6th string and the open 4th and 3rd strings. And again, you can play the optional second string if you want to, which I usually do, but it comes with the same risk that I just mentioned. The next chord, played as an arpeggio, splits a D chord into two parts, and this D chord is sort of played like a C-shaped D. The first part is played with the 4th fret of the 6th string, the open 4th string, and the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. The last part of the chord is played on the 3rd fret of the 2nd string. And the way you play this chord is to play the arpeggio for the first 3 notes, wait about half a beat, and then play the last note like this. The last chord of measure 40 is a simple G chord played on the 5th fret of the 6th string and the open 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. So all of measure 40 sounds like this. Measure 41 has just 2 easy chords. The first is a regular D chord played with the open 5th string. And that's followed by an A7th played with an open 5th string and the 3rd, 2nd, and 1st strings of that A7th chord. And finally, measure 42 is one last C-shaped D played as an arpeggio across the 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, and 2nd strings. So the last measures of the song sound like this, and I'll close out this final replay starting in measure 36. Okay, so that's everything. That's the end of this lesson on my guitar arrangement of the song When I'm Gone by Randy Newman. I know it took a long time, and yes, I know the video and the lesson were a little less than perfect, but thanks for hanging in there. I hope you found some value in it, and I hope it was at least a little bit interesting. If you liked the video and the lesson, then please give me a thumbs up, and if you have any feedback, comments, or questions, then you can leave them in the comments section below, and I'll reply or respond when I can and if necessary. So that's it. Once more, thank you, and so long until next time.